A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z.
Hello. Come and join me as we catalogue Bristol alphabetically. 26 short, informative vignettes spanning history and historians, rivers, places, poets, painters and inventors. The great, the good and the grandiose. An exuberant celebration. Join me. Internationally recognised as one of Britain's best examples of a Victorian garden cemetery, set in a leafy 45-acre Arcadian landscape, a natural amphitheatre dotted with listed and listing historic monuments and classical buildings, silent, uneven rows of marble and granite twined in holly and ivy. There are two mortuary chapels, offering a nice compromise, one Anglican, the other nonconformist. Heroes from the Crimea and both world wars are honoured here. So is Ram Mohan Roy, a Bengali social reformer. He challenged traditional Hindu culture and outlawed the practice of widow burning on their husbands' funeral pyres. His wife would have been pleased. George Muller lies there, more of him later. And members of the Wills family, surprisingly modest memorials for multi-millionaire tobacco barons. Honest Vale has been the final resting place for Bristol folk for more than 170 years. There are 50,000 graves and monuments, and more than 300,000 people are interred here. During the 20th century, the cemetery fell into disrepair, and local groups began campaigning for its restoration. After a £5 million project, Arnos Vale is now a heritage, wildlife and education centre, as well as a working cemetery. The first author to write a full-scale history of Bristol was William Barrett. He was apprenticed to an apothecary and barber surgeon here and qualified in 1755. He practised as a man midwife in Wine Street. His passion was historical research, and he spent many hours documenting the history of Bristol. Barrett met the boy poet Thomas Chatterton, who offered him medieval records and plans. Barrett included them in this volume. It was 25 years in preparation. But he'd not asked young Chatterton for proof of authenticity. All these passages and plans are fictitious nonsense. The young hoaxer attributed the documents not to himself, but to Thomas Rowley, a 15th century merchant buried in St. John's Church. The book was finally published in 1789. Barrett's reputation was severely damaged when the documents proved to be false. He was devastated and died later that year. He made hugely generous legacies to his native city. His name is everywhere, commemorated in landmarks and street names across Bristol. Born here in 1636 to a well-established wealthy merchant family, he worked in Spain, overseeing his father's interests there. Then London and the Royal African Company, which held the monopoly on slave trading. From 1672 to 1689, the company transported around 100,000 slaves from West Africa to the West Indies and America. Here is Colston's deathbed scene, painted more than 100 years after his death. By then, slavery had been abolished, and perhaps that's why a young black servant girl is included. Does the artist intend reconciliation between slaver and the enslaved? Colston, like many of his contemporaries, made money from trades which depended on the enslavement of Africans. But this is not the story told by his monument here. It dwells on his philanthropy. "250 years ago, this was a rough, lonely wasteland. Then, mining licenses were granted, and the terrain became cratered with quarries. But in an early example of enlightened conservation, the 1861 Downs Act was passed to halt suburban spread. The quarries were filled in with mud from the city docks in the 1870s. Up to 2,000 sheep grazed here, but in 1926 the sheep gave way to pitches for cricket, football and hockey, and a flower show, circuses and fun fairs made annual visits. Now there's up to 58 football teams every Saturday in the season. Some areas are left unmown to encourage meadow plants. That Act of Parliament safeguards these 442 acres of lush parkland in perpetuity. Just look at this. It's the largest decorative facade of its kind in England. A unique tiled arts and crafts frontage from 1900. We're in Broad Street, just up from St John's Church. Edward Everard's print works. At the top, between turrets, a massive figure holds a lamp and mirror to symbolise light and truth. Printers Johann Gutenberg and William Morris, both working at their presses, stand each side of an angelic spirit of literature. Below, the company's name is spelled out in twirly letters. Gutenberg invented printing. It's a shame his name is spelt wrongly. It should end with B-E-R-G. Facing him is William Morris, who revived craft printing in the 1890s. Typefaces that they each designed form a backdrop. Everard stipulated a triple archway design for the lower story to echo St John's Gateway nearby, which closes the view. Everard was a highly successful businessman, but he saw printing as more than a business. For him, it was a craft. The River Avon's rather neglected companion. The source is in James Dyson's back garden, Doddington Park in Gloucestershire. Into it is discharged a large mass of filth of the town, and it may be considered a great open sewer. And the quotation endures. Here we are beneath the M32 motorway, close to a bleak retail park. Here's a more inspiring stretch. The river's course from Frenchay to Stapleton is a miniature gorge with pennant sandstone. This is Snuff Mills. The Bristol School of Artists sought inspiration here. Francis Danby's Disappointed Love was painted here in 1821. A figure in a landscape, gloomy, dark water, overcrowded vegetation groping out of the shadows towards the meagre light. menacing oversized weeds in the foreground. Danby intends a story. The girl's dishevelled hair, a bonnet and shawl dropped on the bank, a miniature portrait of a young man, the letter and torn fragments. It's a poem without words.
She's in despair. She's been dumped.
It's everywhere. Mindless tagging of initials in chunky lettering, high up on buildings and railway viaducts, at street level, ugly and vaguely threatening. Vandalism or art? Well, certainly this is very artistic. We're at Upfest, Europe's largest urban art festival in Bedminster. And Banksy. His work is filled with wit and metaphor, parables for our time. His stencil street art transmits mixed messages, anti-war, anti-capitalist, or anti-establishment. In America, sociologists surveyed the graffiti scene. 85% of it is just tags, and another 10% is gang communication. Not much left to be classified as art, then. In English law, graffiti is a crime. The Keep Britain Tidy organisation label it as vandalism. Banksy says that's why he keeps his head down. He's a bit like Chatterton, famous for being anonymous.
Stour Head, leafy, quintessential English landscape. But what's this? A monumental market cross. Originally painted in blue and gold and red and vermilion. It has statues of monarchs in these alcoves. It was erected in 1373 in the centre of Bristol, at the crossroads of its 4 main streets. This central location made it an ideal place for special events, beheadings, royal ceremonies and proclamations, but it got in the way of traffic. By 1733, it was seen as a threat to life and property in high winds. So it was shifted to College Green by the cathedral, and just viewed as a quaint antiquity. But it got in the way again.
This time, visitors at Hotwell Spa, the promenade here, ate abreast. It was dismantled and stored in the cathedral yard for some years. Then, in 1780, the Dean gave it to this grand Wiltshire estate.
Ever since, the citizens of Bristol have wanted their cross back. But now it was too fragile to be moved.
So they commissioned a replica in 1851, and a portion of it is now here, in Berkeley Square.
Bristol has a global reputation for innovation. There are many science and technology organisations based here. But did you know that Bristol is also the home of the Plimsoll line and tarmac?
Samuel Plimsoll was born here in 1824. His compulsory maximum load line on ships meant a new level of safety at sea.
Elizabeth Blackwell, born in 1821. She grew up here at number 1 Wilson Street. Later, the family moved to New York, and there she graduated top of her class in medicine in 1849. She was the world's first woman doctor.
Aardman bring plasticine to life. Take a couple of Rolls-Royce Olympus Vulcan bomber engines, accelerate to 1,450 miles an hour, cruise at 60,000 feet, and you get to New York before you left Heathrow. Perhaps the most beautiful aircraft ever to fly. John Loudon McAdam changed the world's roads from cobbled lanes to smooth surfaces, the first major advance in road construction since Roman times. McAdam lived in Berkeley Square. Joseph Fry had a sweet shop in Small Street, and in 1847 he made the first chocolate bar. Up until then, chocolate was something that people drank. The first propeller-driven ocean liner.
In 1812, a shop was set up to sell a new drink, soda water, here in Hot Wells. The owner, Jacob Schwepp. Here once stood the childhood home of one of the most successful businessmen in post-war Britain. From humble beginnings, John James built up a chain of radio and TV shops.
His first was here in Regent Street, Kingswood. Throughout the 50s, the business grew to 300 branches with 2,500 employees. John was doing well and moved from leafy Sneed Park to even leafier Ascot. He sold the business for £6 million in 1959, retired and used his capital to play the stock market. John set up a charity with £10 million. It paid for many thousands of Bristol pensioners to go on seaside trips to Weston-super-Mare and to hippodrome shows. In 1979, he sold his assets for £25 million. We can draw a parallel with Colston, in that he moved away from the city of his birth, but never forgot it. They both endowed it from a distance with lavish benefactions.
But the means by which they accrued their fortunes could not have been more different. Built in the mid-1600s, King Street has everything. Timber-framed houses, Victorian warehouses, brick merchants' houses, all bookended by medieval almshouses. It starts at Welsh Back, the historic quayside by the original course of the River Avon. Small ships from Wales, trows, tied up here, hence the Landogger Trow pub of 1664. 'Tis said, local lad, Edward Teach, Blackbeard the pirate, supped ale here, The Cooper's Hall. It's so grand that its first floor reaches higher than the gables of these almshouses. It's now the frontage of the finest building in King Street, the Theatre Royal.
The oldest working theatre in the English-speaking world. It has a beautiful, intimate auditorium.
This end of King Street is dubbed the Bermuda Triangle. The Beer Emporium Bar, the Small Bar, and the Royal Navy Volunteer are home to a vast array of craft beers, dozens on tap, and hundreds more in bottles. "500 acres of ancient, broad-leafed woodland, sitting on a promontory, Stokely Camp, a defensive fort with its origins in pre-Roman times.
A proliferation of rare trees, white beams, and what's this? It's Withdrawn, an art installation. part of Bristol's year as European green capital. A flotilla of fishing boats, discordant and immediately prompting questions. How did the boats arrive here? We're being asked to reflect upon how we make an impact on our seas, oceans and climate.
The Bristol School of Artists would paint and sketch here in the early 1800s. At the northern end of the woods is Paradise Bottom, and it's worth seeking out the giant redwood. All 30 metres of it.
In 1836, a Prussian evangelist, George Muller, took 30 orphans into his home here in St Paul's.
The Mullers moved along the street and rented a second house for children, number 1. The following year, number 3 was acquired, and in 1843, number 4. 2 years later, the neighbours had had enough. They complained about the serious inconvenience caused by the presence of so many children.
So, George Muller, a pragmatic Christian, prayed and planned the new orphan houses in Ashley Down. Donations poured in. An architect prepared drawings for no fee. 700 large windows were donated. Over the next 21 years, 5 houses were built costing £100,000, with 17,000 children passing through their doors. And it wasn't workhouse conditions. Instruction in the 3 R's, work in kitchens and the nursery, girls making their own clothes, boys knitting their own socks. He saved thousands of children in an age when there was no social security system. His funeral cortege was followed by 10,000 people, including 1,000 orphans. Now, these monumental buildings are a mix of apartments and college premises for hair and beauty and plumbing courses. A tidal bypass of the early 18th century. It takes the River Avon around the harbour, leaving the ships to berth in water of a constant depth, the floating harbour. It runs from Chatterton Basin near Templemeads to the underfall sluices at Rownham. There's ornate footbridges, and here's the Chocolate Path, named because its paving blocks resemble chocolate bars. It took a lot of digging. More than 1,000 men were employed on it, mainly English and Irish navvies, well experienced in digging canals across Britain. It opened on the 1st of May 1809, and a celebratory dinner for the workforce, at which 2 oxen roasted whole, a proportionate weight of potatoes, and 600 weight of plum pudding were consumed, along with a gallon of strong beer for each man. The beer ran out, and the navvies rounded off the evening by an England versus Ireland mass brawl. One of the Bristol School of Artists, William West, has his 2 finest paintings in the city's museum and art gallery. The Israelites passing through the wilderness. And here's the other, the Avon Gorge from the summit of the observatory, the vantage point that he rented in 1828, the Clifton Observatory. It was his home and studio. He installed a large telescope into the tower, then in 1829 a camera obscura, which projects panoramic views of the Avon Gorge. West had a strong interest in optics and engineering. He challenged Brunel to use cables, not wrought iron chains, for the Clifton suspension bridge. He dug a tunnel linking his observatory to St Vincent's Cave 250 feet above the floor of the Avon Gorge and 90 feet below the cliff top. This 200-foot-long tunnel took 2 years to build, and since 1837, tourists have been gingerly shuffling down it to enjoy the panorama. A little railway opened in 1865 to transport passengers, livestock and goods to Evenmouth Dock, the Bristol Port Railway and Pier Company. It wasn't a branch line. It wasn't connected to any other routes. At the start, the locos needed to be brought in by road.
It ran from Hotwell Station, here, beneath the Clifton Suspension Bridge, and through tunnels either side of Bridge Valley Road and alongside the river to Snuff Mills and then inland to Shirehampton and finally Evenmouth.
The line's isolation didn't last long. For Evenmouth to develop as a port, a link to the mainline network was essential. So it was connected to a new line in 1877, the Clifton Extension Railway. This line linked Templemead Station with the well-to-do suburb of Clifton, and from Clifton it burrowed beneath the Downs and joined the Port Railway at Sneed Park Junction.
Construction of the A4 Portway Road destroyed much of the line. This remaining stretch of the Clifton Railway is now part of the Severn Beach Line. In 2004, it was highlighted by Thomas Cook as one of the scenic lines of Europe.
In 1125, William of Malmesbury described the most celebrated town called Bristol with a port, which is a commodious and safe harbour for all vessels, into which come ships from Ireland and Norway and from other lands beyond the seas.
And when John Wesley heard that a theatre was proposed here, he exploded with Methodist vigour. The endeavours lately used to procure subscriptions for building a new playhouse have given us not a little concern. Most of the present stage entertainments sap the foundations of all religions, as they naturally tend to efface all traces of piety and seriousness out of the minds of men. Drinking and debauchery are constant attendants, with indolence, effeminacy, and idleness. Sounds good to me.
Bristol was central to the Romantic movement and its poetry. Robert Southey, poet laureate for 30 years, is one of the best known of the unread poets. His name is better known than the work he produced, although he did originate the Goldilocks fairy tale.
He was a friend of fellow poets Coleridge and Wordsworth. In 1795, they used to meet here at the Rummer and discuss the concept of a utopian society.
That same year, Southey and Coleridge married sisters here.
Southey edited the works of Thomas Chatterton, who lived close by. The church inspired Chatterton to write his mock-medieval verse.
Here's an apologetic little memorial to Chatterton, rather smaller than the one outside to Tom, the church cat. Chatterton achieved more fame through his death than through his life. He died before his 18th birthday in a garret here in Holborn.
Back in King Street, this was the third library in England, the Bristol Free Library of 1739, with thousands of books and 200 borrowers, including Coleridge and Southey.
Samuel Sayer was an English schoolmaster and cleric. In about 1790, Sayer taught at the Royal Fort School. His pupils found him narrow-minded and unjust. In 1813, Sayer became perpetual curate of Horfield, and in 1824, rector of Filton. He knew William Barrett well, and mindful that Barrett had been deceived, he checked the content of these volumes. They tell a much more accurate story of Bristol's history. His Memoirs, Historical and Topographical, of Bristol and its neighbourhood appeared in the 1820s in 2 volumes. It's a history of Bristol down to the 1760s, and a much more successful attempt at documenting the city's history. Just look at the names of these subscribers, local folk who paid up front for copies of these volumes. Major players in the mercantile life of Bristol and of the sugar plantations in the West Indies.
Chatterton, the suburb with a prophetic name. In 1972, its central section was demolished. 550 houses went, and around 2,000 people were evicted.
Planners wanted an urban continuation of the M32, the outer circuit road, with a 4-level highway interchange at Three Lamps Junction. In the end, it was never built.
Henry Bradbear lived here. He held out against the bulldozers for 3 years.
He was in the middle house, held up by the ones on each side.
Bristol suffered from Luftwaffe raids. Chatterton was spared, but the planners did what the war could not.
The suburb was built for the nearby railway industry in the late 19th century. There were Victorian pubs and corner shops and densely packed houses here.
There's a tight network of precipitous roads here in Upper Chatterton. Vale Street is reckoned to be the steepest residential road in England.
These fabled creatures are quite common round these parts. The council house, now named City Hall. It took longer to build than the Parthenon. The foundation stone was laid in 1938, the war halted work, and it was opened by the Queen in 1956. The building was to have ornamental ridging all along the roof, but the architect saved £600 by opting for a cheaper mythical alternative, 2 unicorns. But he hadn't told anyone and was on holiday in Italy when they were delivered. The committee waited for him to get back and eventually approved the 12-foot gilt bronze creatures.
One urban myth says that the architect faced the unicorns away from Unity Street because someone he didn't like worked there.
The first thing he would see when he walked out into the street was their bottoms. When Lansdowne Place was built, it was a standalone terrace. Then Royal Promenade was added, more of a palace than a terrace. An 1849 guide reports, 2 rows of elegant and commodious houses have been lately built which form 2 sides of a square. The other 2 are progressing. Clifton's biggest square has 3 sides, 1 Regency, 1 plummy Italianate, and 1 Lombardic Romanesque. The 4th side never got built. It's just 1860s semis. None the worse for it, though. The splendid mature trees pull it all successfully together. This southwest side is least admired. Too many windows, perhaps. Basically, it's just restless repetition, an uninspiring facade repeated 33 times. William Worcester was a 15th century English chronicler and antiquary. Born in Bristol in 1415, he travelled widely and returned to Bristol in retirement in 1480.
William was fascinated to the point of obsession with numbers, distances and angles. He paced, measured and counted his way around late medieval Bristol with details of churches, chapels, the castle, houses, streets and lanes.
This is the Bristol he knew. Towers and spires rising above a huddle of houses punctuated the cityscape in 1480.
In his slow, deliberate way, he measured in yards or in steps. The combined length of his 2 feet placed heel to toe, about 21 inches.
Churches were his principal landmarks. He climbed stairs, allowing 8 inches per step. Sometimes he measured tower height in fathoms, perhaps by dangling a rope down the side.
The length of the Church of Holy Cross, Temple Church, measures 57 yards and, by estimation, about 100 steps. At the back, next to the street called Baldwin Street, I have seen 12 women washing woolen cloth. For the good wives, when the tide there turns towards the sea, the River Avon coming from Bristol Bridge shall be clear and fresh. On the south side of Corn Street from the High Cross, going past the Church of All Saints, there are 17 cellars.
Where public hangings provided lively entertainment. The grim gateway of the new jail overlooks the new cut in Cumberland Road. At a trial at this pub on the 11th of April 1821, John Horwood, just 3 days after his 18th birthday, was convicted of murder.
He'd thrown a stone at his former sweetheart here in Hannam Woods. The wound became infected and she died, possibly as a result of the surgeon's trepanning rather than the original minor wound. 2 days later, an enormous crowd packed nearby streets to watch Horwood being led to the scaffold. There was a real concern that the crush would lead to spectators falling into the new cut.
His corpse was delivered to Bristol Royal Infirmary for dissection in front of medical students. Anatomical notes were kept and were bound up with the transcript of the trial. His flayed skin was used to bind the pages into a book.
He's buried here. He wrote a poem in his condemned cell. John Horwood is my wretched name, and Hannam gave me birth. My previous time has been employed in rioting and mirth. Eliza. Oh, Eliza, dear, thy spirit, oh, is fled. And thy poor mangled body lies now numbered with the dead. Cursed be the hand that gave the blow, and cursed the fatal stone which made thy precious lifeblood flow. For it has me undone. Here's a verse from a poem on the inhumanity of the slave trade written by a milkmaid in 1788. Bristol, thine heart hath throbbed with glory. Slaves, e'en Christian slaves, have shook their chains and gazed with wonder and amazement on thee. Hence, ye grovelling souls, who think the term I give of Christian slave a paradox, to you I do not turn, but leave you to conception narrow, with that be blessed, nor dare to stretch your shackled souls along the course of freedom.
Anne Yearsley lived here, just above Jacob's Wells Road, with 6 young infants born in the space of 7 years, while caring for an aged mother. She was rescued from destitution by Hannah More, the poet and social reformer.
More set up Yearsley with a lending library in 1793, here in the colonnade at Hotwell Spa, on the banks of the River Avon.
Under More's patronage, Yearsley published poems. More corrected her grammar and set up a trust to benefit her.
But the 2 women fell out over access to funds gained from the success of her volumes. The £500 accrued was not enough for Yearsley. She wanted access to the whole of the capital sum. It did not end well. A bitter struggle ensued between the 2 women. Anne Yearsley was one of the first working class women of the time to gain recognition as a writer.
You come face to face with over 400 species of exotic, endangered and adorable animals from across the globe. Opened in 1836, Bristol Zoo is the world's oldest provincial zoo and the 5th oldest in the world. As animal care evolves, the buildings are adapted. The giraffe house now has gorillas. The old monkey temple is home to an exhibit called Smarty Plants, showing how plants use and manipulate animals to survive. There's a proud breeding record here. 1934, the first chimpanzee born in Europe. 1958, the first black rhino born in Britain. You can watch seals and penguins from above and below the water. The large net allows terns and eiders to fly around this enclosure. The terrace is one of the oldest parts of the zoo. It's home to a pair of lions, red pandas, fruit bats and flamingos. Exotic butterflies and moths in their nectar garden. 115 species, tropical and temperate, freshwater and marine.
So that's our A to Z journey through Bristol, 26 items. For a blockbuster sequel, we could go to Cambodia. Their Khmer language has 74 characters. Or maybe it would be easier to go to Papua New Guinea and the island of Bougainvillea. Their Rotokis language has only 12 letters. Thank you, seagulls.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. As you were, if you prefer, you could finish with Z instead.
I'm going. Ready?
Camera running. Action.
Here once stood the childhood home of one of the most successful businessmen in post-war Britain. From humble beginnings... I'll start again. I bet that bloody thing does it again. That's got to go in the outtakes, isn't it? Here once stood the childhood home of one of the most successful businessmen in post-war Britain.
Yeah, running.
Here once stood the childhood home of one of the most successful businessmen in post-war Britain. From humble beginnings, John James built up a chain of radio and TV shops.